Hi there, Michael here. Earlier this month, Maximus Audio, Maximus spelled with a 1 instead of the I, released a new immersive 3D audio plugin called Vertigo, also spelled with a 1 instead of the I. This is a spatial and surround sound audio panel that has a couple of very interesting features that I think a lot of people in the immersive audio community will be very excited about. So I think we need to talk about it. Now, if you have not yet heard of Maximus Audio, they are a fairly new and extremely active developer who arrived in the immersive audio production scene only a few months ago. I reviewed the first plugin, UpMixer, a couple of weeks ago and was genuinely impressed with how they approached the user experience in their plugins. And yes, UpMixer is also spelled with a 1 instead of the I. In my experience, Maximus Audio plugins are designed to be extremely easy to use and are therefore especially interesting to anyone new to 3D audio production. Vertigo is their latest plugin. In their own words, it is a unique spatial and surround auto panner with unlimited creative potential. We will see if that is really the case or just marketing talk. Vertigo also comes on the heels of Sound Particle Speed Panner, another new 3D audio panning plugin that I reviewed last week. The link to that video is in the description. So what I also want to do in this video is to compare the two plugins so that you can better decide which one to buy. Little spoiler, both are absolutely excellent, but they do things differently, so depending on your workflow, you might prefer one over the other. Now, before we jump in, a quick disclaimer. Maximus Audio provided me with a free reviewer's license, but this is not a sponsored video. They do not get to see this video before it goes live, and they also did not have any influence on what I'm going to say. All opinions are strictly my own. And with that being said, let's open up Reaper and load in Vertigo. So here we have Reaper, and I'm going to work with the same project that I also used last week, which is a super simple project. It's just one track, one instance of tune with a one finger preset and one MIDI file that has exactly one note, because that's quite frankly all that you need in order to demonstrate how the panning works. Now, tune here sits on a 16 channel track because I'm going to work with 9.1.6. And then in order for you guys to actually hear something, I need to convert it back into stereo. So I'm going to use the Virtuoso Binaural renderer for that purpose, which is a channel favorite. I'm going to leave some links in the description where you can find that. And that will allow us to kind of convert whatever the panner is doing back into stereo. Now I'm going to work on a Mac today, but anything that I'm going to show you works in Windows as well, and it should work with any digital audio workstation that is multi-channel capable. Now you could technically also use that in a stereo digital audio workstation, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You know, kind of maybe as an effect, I'm not quite sure, but usually you would use such a plugin in a multi-channel setup, and any multi-channel DAW really works. Now before we do anything, let's have a quick listen what we have here. And once again, this is really super simple. One track, one MIDI note, one plugin, one binaural renderer. That's all it is. So let's add Vertigo to move things around a little. And for that, I'm first going to close Virtuoso here. And let's just add Vertigo. Where is Vertigo? Here we have Vertigo, Maximus Audio. Let's add that. And this is going to open up the interface. Now, this is actually a fun interface, and it looks a little bit kind of confusing at first, but it's actually really, really simple, and everything is laid out in a very, very logical way. Now, before we do anything, we probably need to first tell Vertigo what output format we would like to have, and this is something that we set here in the out format. And we have a couple of different options. Once again, we have anything up to 9.1.6, and then we also have ambisonics if you want to, so it goes up to 7th channel ambisonics actually. If you've seen my video about Beat Panner last week, that only went up to 6th order ambisonics. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference because quite frankly, you usually don't need these high orders, but you know, kind of it's nice to have. And what we're going to do here is we're going to simply switch it over to 9.1.6 as the output. Now the input by default is stereo, however we can set it to multi-in, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later because the way the multi-in works with Vertigo is a little bit unusual because it does not really allow you to give granular control on the individual channels. It rather kind of thinks of the entire 9.1.6 input as one thing, and it also doesn't really allow you to fine-tune that. So if your layout doesn't really match the layout that Vertigo accepts or expects, you need to kind of fiddle around a little. So this is something that actually kind of doesn't really work super fine, but usually you would probably only have a stereo signal or maybe even a mono signal, so you can actually switch it over to mono here as well. So, but we have a stereo signal. If you have a stereo signal, you can change here the stereo width, and you see here in the left-right channels that if I increase that, it will actually increase the distance between left and right channel. And that actually helps. Now, on the left side, we have the visualizer, and the visualizer shows you the path that is currently on. And in order to demonstrate how this works, we should probably play the audio. We can see here how left and right channel are moving around the path. We have a pattern width knob or pattern width kind of control here. We can increase or decrease the pattern width if you want to do that. There's also a focus knob. This focus setting allows you to kind of change the way the signal or the resulting signal is moving from speaker position to speaker position. So usually when you are moving the sounds around, what can happen actually is that it smears a little, and in order to give it a little bit more focus, you might want to emphasize the actual sound that comes out of a particular speaker position. So what this does is it sort of really focuses more on the actual speakers in the output. The result is that it might be a little bit kind of sharper in the way you perceive that signal, but it also jumps a little. So my recommendation is just play around with the focus here, and that will essentially kind of tell you then if this is something you want to do or not. In my case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to turn it off. Now I can change the length. I can change how it syncs. Currently it's set to 125 beats per minute. I can change the direction, so it's currently clockwise, but I can also change it to counterclockwise. I can set it to bounce, and bounce essentially means that it's going to do one round and then going to come back. So it's going to kind of, come back again. We have an expert section here, and I'm going to come back to that a little later because that's actually really, really interesting. Now, if you want to kind of have a bit of a better view, we can actually move that around. So for example, if I look at it from the top, I can see that. And then obviously we can change the pattern, and there are a couple of different patterns that we have, and the nice thing about the Vertigo is that it actually kind of tells you visually of what you want to, how you can actually change the position. So for example, if you want to have a Lisa Schuh curve, you can do that. Now you might notice that the left and right channels are moving kind of weirdly, and that is because the way the panning works is that it pans an anchor point, and the anchor point is the point between left and right channel. So if I'm, for example, now changing the stereo width to 0, making that a mono signal essentially, you see that that anchor point moves around the Lisa Schuh curve. But if I'm increasing that, it's actually sort of wobbling around. And one of my concerns or one of my complaints is that I have very little control about how that actually wobbles around. So it would really be nice to have more fine control over left and right channel individually. And at least in my understanding, this is not something that you can do right now. So we can also do a star. Maybe you want to increase the length. Now currently it's just in one plane, so let me just kind of move that, so it's just in one plane. So I can also change the pattern of the C plane. So for example, I can move that up and down. And then I can change what type of pattern I have. So currently it's flat, which means it's completely flat. Or I can also change that to a sine curve, and that will then essentially kind of move that according to a sine curve. I can actually increase the number of kind of up and downs that I have here. I can increase where exactly it is, and that way it allows me to control the three-dimensionality of the signal, which is actually really nice. Now, if you don't want to use any of those patterns, you can actually also draw a pattern yourself. And the way to do that is simply to go here over to the draw section. And there are a couple of different ways on how you can do that. So for example, you can just draw freely. So that's one option. Or you can also use so let me clear that again. You can also use a smoothing option that kind of takes your input and kind of smooths it out a little. So if you don't have a steady hand, that might be a good option to do. So if I kind of do something crazy, it's going to then smooth it out. And I can do that. Or I can also do lines and dots and so forth. So that's actually really nice. And I have the same option here in the vertical as well. So I can do the same thing here and kind of do all kinds of weird and unexpected things. Now, the next thing we have here is an effects section, and for that, let me maybe go back to a more regular pattern. Let's just do the orbit, and then maybe do just a regular orbit, because that's really all that we need. And let's turn it over to the effects section. We have a couple of effects that we can apply. So for example, we have a transgate, and we have a modulation option and a filter option. So these are here, and I can turn that on and off if I want to. So let's just play the audio. So for example, I can turn on the gate, and I can set the gate here. There's also an envelope that I can set that goes along with the gate. I have a modulation section here. So let's turn off the gate in order to hear it a little bit better. With a flanger, a phaser, and a chorus. And I have a filter that I can also kind of modulate accordingly. And that's an interesting option. Now, I'm honestly not entirely sure how useful this really is, because my understanding is that these effects work on the entire signal, so on all channels, and that essentially means that you could just use an effect after Vertigo, and you wouldn't necessarily need the effect within Vertigo, but kind of it's nice to have. So if you want to use it, it is there. And then you have one final option, and that is this export section here. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to take the automation of the position that you dialed in with Vertigo and export it into an automation lane. Now, why would you want to do that? The reason you would want to do that is because there are certain situations where you actually require to use a very specific panner. So if you're working with object-oriented audio, for example, Dolby Atmos would be a good example. You have to use the Dolby Atmos panner, and you cannot use any other 3D panner. So what you technically need to do is you need to take the automation that comes out of Vertigo and then copy it over into the Dolby Atmos panner. And that way you can use Vertigo in connection with objects in a Dolby Atmos mix, for example. Now, this is super interesting, and this is actually something that I might actually cover in a separate video, because it's a little specific and it goes into certain detail, and it's also a little bit different depending on the digital audio workstation that you're using. But at least it is something that allows you to apply Vertigo in a way that kind of honors the requirements of object-oriented audio. So you can simply use that in Dolby Atmos or MPEG-H or any other object-oriented audio where you actually need to use that particular panner, and you can simply export the automation and then copy that automation over to your panner and use Vertigo that way. This is, for example, something that Beat Panner last week could not do. So if you're working with the Sound Particles Beat Panner, you're a little bit out of luck. With Vertigo can actually do that. And then there's one final thing that I just wanted to show you, and that is how the multi-in works, or the multi-channel input works. And that is a little bit unusual and quite frankly also not that particularly useful, if I'm perfectly honest. So if I'm playing the audio, for example, and I've switched it to multi-in, what's going to happen is it's going to take in the individual channels and going to distribute them according to the way the channels are usually distributed, and then just move them along with the anchor point. And while this is a logical way to do that, it's also a relatively useless way to do that. I would actually like to have a little bit more fine-grained control over each individual channel so that I can be a little bit more innovative with the panning. Now, currently, this is not possible. Maybe this is something they're going to implement in the future. But you have at least have the option to kind of take in a multi-channel signal if that is something that you have. So what's my final verdict? Well, I generally like the plugin and its ease of use. The fact that you have a selection of patterns ready to go makes the plugin a good choice for quickly adding some movement to immersive audio mixes. One thing that I find particularly important is that you can export the panning automation to an object panner in an object-oriented audio mix. If you're working with Dolby Atmos, for example, this is an important feature. I will probably do a separate video about that in the not-too-distant future, so make sure that you're subscribed to get notified when I release that video. I also have a few minor gripes with this plugin. Most importantly, I would like to have a little bit more control over the individual speaker positions. The way the plugin works only allows you to automate an anchor position of the incoming audio signal. but you have effectively no control over how the individual channels move with respect to this anchor point. In the stereo example, the left and right channels would rotate around the anchor position, but if I don't want that, I'm kind of without options. There are also a few minor inconsistencies in the interface. For example, the interface shows you the selection of horizontal patterns visually, but the vertical ones only as a drop-down. Now, this isn't really a big deal, but it demonstrates that the interface could still use a bit of tweaking. Now the big question, how does this compare to Sound Particle Speed Penner, which I reviewed last week? Well, they're doing the same thing, but in completely different ways. While Vertigo is a real auto penner that allows you to smoothly move sounds around in 3D space, Beat Penner is more of a penning sequencer. And depending on your needs, you might prefer one over the other. Both are great options, and I highly recommend that you check out the trial versions to decide which one to add to your workflow. Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comment section below or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.